the Australian law was changed in the Sex Discrimination Act. They took out the definition of sex.
When he's taken on no less than 4 jobs since stepping down a few months ago under the guise of being too tired and simply exhausted to go on.
But what happened was the media said, oh, that's not what she said. Actually, she really meant more like this. And that other time that she said they're all spewing racism, that's not what she meant either. And
welcome to the Aussie Wire News. What we have for you this week is 2 pre-recorded episodes of the Aussie Wire News. Now, these stories are very relevant, but not necessarily breaking news. And that's because the Aussie Wire team have already begun making their way to the UK in preparation for our coverage of the Alliance of Responsible Citizenship launch. Now, you don't want to miss any of our coverage of the ARC launch, so make sure you're following all our social media channels via the handle @TheAussieWire, and especially make sure that you've gone to our website, checked out our blogs, and joined our email list. That way you can be sure you won't miss out on anything, even if we're cancelled off social media. Also, by joining that email list, you could win over $300 worth of Aussie Wire merchandise. More on that later in this episode. But first, here's the news. Well, why can't women talk about sex? Strange question, maybe one that's never crossed your mind, but it's a question that is being asked because there are many women out there who are beginning to feel like actually, well, they can't. They can't talk about things that used to be considered progressive, used to be considered liberating things to talk about. Now, all of a sudden, they believe they're being shut down. One such example is my next guest, Sal Grover. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Sal, your story is interesting. I want to get to that more towards the end of the interview, but I want to talk about this question. Why can't women talk about sex? There are now events being held that have this title, Why Can't Women Talk About Sex? What is this about?
Well, the reality is that every time we do, or that we want biological sex to be acknowledged, we're punished. And so that's what we're actually talking about. There's been a few criticisms of like, oh, you say you can't talk about sex, but then you're going and doing all of these events, so it means you can. These people are completely missing the point of what it is we're trying to do. The simple reality is that in 2013, the Australian law was changed in the Sex Discrimination Act. They took out the definition of sex in the Sex Discrimination Act.
Right.
And they took out the definition of men and women. And then they added in gender identity. So what happened was a very muddled act that no one really knows what's more important, whether it's gender or sex. And then you've got women who really need female-only spaces or sport or services. And we're being told that we can't have any of these unless we include men who say they're women. And it's just creating chaos in society. So while we're doing these events to get clarity in politics and in law, unfortunately, predictably, but unfortunately, a lot of politicians are sort of trying to ignore it as much as possible. I think that they're doing that because I think they'll let us do most of the heavy lifting and then they'll come in and swoop in at the end when it is beneficial to them. So in the meantime, we do the heavy lifting and want to make people in Australia realize that this is a very serious issue because obviously women's rights are sort of at the forefront and we're the canary in the coal mine here, but it is everybody's rights because if in law you're forced to say that a man is a woman, you don't have the right to freedom of belief and freedom of speech anymore. So this is the implications that come out. And if we want to be living in a free society where everybody has rights, we need to be able to, at the very least, talk about what role biological sex plays in all of these rights.
So, Sal, you mentioned, obviously, politicians planning to come in and claim credit once all the heavy lifting's done. Classic politicians, we've seen that many times before. You're probably correct, but there are a few exceptions. There have been a few politicians that have been willing to come out in support of this. And in fact, the Why Can't Women Talk About Sex events, one has been held at the New South Wales Parliament House, another has been held at the Victorian Parliament House. So what's your sense of progress here? There are obviously a few politicians that recognise the problem, many that refuse to. What's the way forward for you here?
Yeah, there's a few politicians in Australia from Claire Chandler, obviously Moira Deeming, Alex Antic, Sarah Game, Pauline Hanson has been very outspoken, and she's actually been really fantastic of trying to bring awareness to sort of the medicalisation of children, that's sort of a whole other area that's not my expertise at all. But so there really are some politicians who are really trying to do stuff. but they're just met with roadblocks by everybody else. And not only roadblocks, which is obviously normal in politics, but it's the slurs that are thrown the other way of just this transphobia and bigotry and everything. You're like, can we not just have a mature, fact-based discussion? If we can have that, we can get somewhere. But this at the moment is unsustainable. And if we look to literally every other country where this is happening, our side is going to win because we have facts, logic, reason, and reality on our side. It is inevitable. This movement, ideology is not sustainable. It will lose eventually. So it's like either, I don't know. I mean, which side of that do you want to be on? We're always hearing this, wrong side of history or whatever. But only history is the judge of that. It's just like, do you want to be on the side of facts or do you want to be on the side of ideology?
Yeah. Facts have a way of not changing even when we want them to. What I find very interesting about this from a more of a sociological point of view is the way that there's a sense in which the people that were considered the heroes of third wave feminism, the Martina Navratilovas of this world, the Germaine Greers of this world, the J.K. Rowlings of this world, a very, very high profile example there, who were considered heroes, either Martina Navratilova for being a very public lesbian who was a very high profile, the best tennis player in the world in her prime, and others are now considered the enemy. What's happened here to allow those people to find themselves being thrown under the bus like this?
Because gender ideology is a men's fetish sexual rights movement, and so it's being decorated as this progressive civil rights, human rights movement. It's not at all. Martina Navratilova is not saying anything different to what she was saying 40 years ago. She's actually still out there fighting for lesbian rights, the same thing she's always done. Now she's vilified, I would say even more than 40 years ago. Now she is shamed, she's called a bigot, all of these things, not only for speaking out about lesbians, but because she is one.
Yeah.
Because she says men aren't lesbians. It's as simple as that. I mean, this is what I say about facts and reality or ideology. If you're on the side of an ideology that says a man can be a lesbian, you don't have anything working in your favor. You're talking absolute nonsense.
Well, this has some very real-world applications. This is a decision by the Sex Discrimination Commission that I only came across thanks to your work. Tell us what this decision is about and who this affects.
So the Lesbian Action Group is a Melbourne-based group of lesbians, and they want to hold some events for lesbians. Now, the fact that we should even have to say that they would be female-only events or only female-born lesbians is ridiculous. By definition, a lesbian can only be a female. So I think it's the Pride Centre in Victoria denied the lesbians the right to have an event. So the Lesbian Action Group went to the Australian Human Rights Commission, Sex Discrimination Commission, to ask for a temporary exemption from any sort of claims of discrimination to be able to have an event. And the AHRC/Sex Discrimination Commission has denied it, basically saying that they would be discriminating against men who claim to be women. And so obviously the implications of this are you're pushing lesbianism back into the underground, that they have to go behind closed doors and do everything in private. But it doesn't even take away discrimination in two ways. One, the Sex Discrimination Commission is now discriminating against lesbians on the basis of sex. Under the guise of gender ideology equality. This is ridiculous. Or gender identity equality, I should say. But also just say, okay, the Lesbian Action Group went, okay, fine, well, we'll hold the event and men who claim to be women can come along to it. And it's a dating event.
Right.
These men are going to be discriminated against at the event. No one's going home with them. So they basically just under the guise of kindness, they're putting these men in a position to be rejected and humiliated. I actually don't think that's kind. I think it would be better to say, hey, go hold your own event. Go hold an event of lesbians, including men who think they're women events. See who turns up to it. If we're going to talk about having a free society where no one's discriminated against, it should be that lesbians can have female-only events. We can have female-only spaces, female-only sport. You can also have trans-only events, which incidentally the Pride Centre in Victoria hosts trans-only events all the time. Have your trans-only things, have, lesbian plus trans events, just have it all. There's a smorgasbord available here and everybody's kind of just going only into the trans stuff because the movement, the activism behind it is so strong.
Now, Sal, am I correct in saying that this is not where you ever thought you were going to end up? If I've got my history correct here, you kind of were dragged into this because you launched a thing called Giggle. Tell us a little bit about Giggle, what you were trying to do, and I guess the hot water that has now landed you in.
Yeah, I mean, I could not have walked into this more blindly. I had no idea any of this was going on when we were developing the app. It was my mum and I who just wanted to create an app for women where women could find roommates, freelance work, connect to talk about all different issues in their life. We also had a lesbian dating platform on there. I say had because the app is currently offline at the moment. It will be relaunched, but it's just offline at the moment. I didn't think that it was controversial in any sort of serious way to do it. We knew that there'd be a little bit of pushback because there's always that sort of like, oh, don't women have enough kind of, chatter. And I was like, oh, that's fine. That's easy enough to handle. We got cancelled straight out of the gate. I mean, the trans activists found us. They inundated us with 1-star reviews calling us transphobic simply because they didn't or don't include men who claim to be women. I mean, like when I say cancelled, I'm talking like media, anyone who was prepared to speak to us before we were accused of transphobia, suddenly the responding to emails stopped. Yeah. No companies would work with us. It was just a terrifying place to be as a startup. And so I started to speak out about it. I wanted to sort of correct some lies that were being told. I wanted to basically say, oh, hang on, what's being said isn't true. And this is what is actually true. And I honestly thought in my naive optimism that, this will be over in a few months. Like people will go, oh, this is silly what's happening. Of course, no, like off you go. No, that is not what has happened. Now I, for some reason, have gained some kind of notoriety in this country because I say women don't have a penis, which is the stupidest sentence.
That was not on my bingo card for controversial statements in 2023.
I know, I have a master's degree. I actually have things that I've learned that I could talk about more than this. It's ridiculous. But basically, I just kept speaking out about it because I just, not only professionally, but personally, I knew it was really important because these are my rights, they're your rights as well. It's everyone's rights. And I really care about that. And I could see that there was a huge, big danger to society of forcing people to believe something that is so blatantly untrue. So I kept speaking out, and now I'm being taken to federal court by a man who claims to be a woman, and that will happen next year. Yeah. So
now I'm sorry. I know this is taking the piss a little bit, but I cannot leave off this interview without asking you, would you please tell me what is the title of the court case that you are now facing?
The title of the court case is Tickle v. Giggle, which I know sounds like a puppet show, but it is actually an incredibly serious case in Australian law. You couldn't make it up. I was a screenwriter in a previous career, and if I had written this in a script, the first script note I would have gotten is that's too on the nose. No one will believe that. Second draft.
Tickle versus Giggle, for anyone that missed it. We will be treated to the reality of judges and court orderlies, etc., having to keep a straight face while saying, and now we come to the matter of, we call the witnesses in Tickle versus Giggle. It brings to mind for me Al Gore, former US presidential candidate who was really pushing emissions trading and carbon trading schemes. He had a carbon trading company. He's made a lot of money out of that particular grift. His business partner's name was Blood, and the firm was Blood and Gore. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction.
It is. Sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction. But then you know what? Also, sometimes the truth is really, really boring. And the truth is that men aren't women. And so you sort of need all of these like fun things to dress it up and make it really interesting. But yeah, it's like I say the same thing every time I speak in these things, and I'm just repeating myself. Like men are not women. You can go and identify however you want. If you're a man and wearing women's clothes and telling yourself you're a woman is what gets you up in the morning and makes you live your best life, all power to you. I really don't care. I only care if I'm being forced to believe it. And when I say me, I mean everybody.
Yeah.
So that's what it comes down to. But so with our case, we're going as far as we need to with it. Like there's a huge chance it will end up in the High Court, which again, it's ridiculous that have to go to the High Court to say that men aren't women, but that's what gender ideology has done to basically every country it has infected. And yeah, I mean, we'll keep fighting, and then we win, and then Lesbian Action Group and all lesbians in their own groups can have female-only events, as we can also have female-only sport, and girls don't have to, have boys on the team just because they say they're a girl.
Yeah. So for anyone that wants to follow this case and potentially even support you, obviously these things aren't cheap, and also to find out more about these Why Can't Women Talk About Sex events, where would they go to get more information?
So for the case, we have a crowdfunder website called gigglecrowdfund.com. There's all information on there of what sort of the case involves, where we're going with it. Whenever there's updates, we'll add them. But at the moment, it's just behind the scene, like sort of procedures stuff. There's nothing to update at the moment. And we have to raise $500,000 to fight this in federal court, which is a huge stress and terrifying. So we appreciate all the help that we get in doing that. And then for the events, the Why Can't Women Talk About Sex events, there will be more happening in the new year. So from my understanding, the Melbourne one was the last one for this year, but we still have obviously Western Australia, Hobart, South Australia, and Queensland.
Well, good luck with it all, Sal. Thank you so much for coming on to the Aussie Wire. We will have you back on, and I want to follow this story. We're not going to cancel you off our platform just because you're standing up for biological reality. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're giving away 2 Aussie Wire hoodies plus 2 Aussie Wire t-shirts in either men's or ladies' cut, plus some other goodies to one lucky subscriber to our email list. Now, if you're already subscribed to the Aussie Wire emails, good for you. You've already been entered in the draw. But if you're not subscribed, now is the time to head over to the AussieWire.com and join our email list so you're in the running for a random draw that could win you a $300 wardrobe refresh in the form of Aussie Wire merch. That's the AussieWire.com. Well, here at the Aussie Wire, we couldn't help but notice, and no doubt you noticed as well, there was a rash of resigned suddenly. Slightly different to the other thing that's happening that no one's allowed to talk about. Resigned suddenly. Prime ministers from all over the world suddenly stepping down. Premiers from all over Australia seemed to be following suit. They were dropping like flies at one point, and Mark McGowan was no exception. He resigned because he was, well, the poor guy was just exhausted. He was so tired that he felt he couldn't continue to do the job of Premier, and so he stepped aside to allow someone with more vigour and more energy, someone who was less exhausted. Well, I thought, we'd better do a welfare check. We'd better check in on poor old Mark McGowan and make sure he's okay, so I thought I'd talk to my favourite West Australian, Kate Fantinel. Thank you for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thanks, Topher.
How is poor Mark? Have you visited him in hospital recently, kept him company as he recuperates from this exhaustion?
No, and I don't think I'll get the chance to when he's taken on no less than 4 jobs since stepping down a few months ago under the guise of being too tired and simply exhausted to go on. Seems like $275,000 a year from the taxpayer just isn't enough for him.
Well, I mean, the man's got expenses. He's got to maintain that lifestyle of the rich and famous, or at the very least, the powerful. You say 4 jobs. Now, to my knowledge, this includes a job, I believe it was with BHP or with Rio Tinto? Remind me.
He's got 2 jobs with mining companies, including Mineral Resources and BHP. So the very companies that he ruled over the last 6 years, he's now sitting in their boardrooms earning a crust from them.
He's also working with Joe Hockey. There's another job in there as well somewhere. How he has time for all of this, I'm not quite sure. And I believe he's also hit the speaking circuit now as well, charging tens of thousands of dollars for those who would like to listen to him talk for an hour or so.
I believe it's $15,000 appearance fee to see former Premier Mark McGowan. I'm not too sure what he will be talking about. Perhaps it may be the iron ore curtain, or how he kept us in a state of emergency for 963 days. I mean, there is a lot to talk about.
Well, look, I think if he's charging $15,000, it creates a real opportunity for you and I, Kate. We can just market ourselves for $14,999. Bargain. Absolute bargain, and the bookings will come flooding in, no doubt. It's quite an extraordinary thing, though, and to be serious about this for a moment, and I'm sorry to do that, but to be serious for a moment, we do see this a lot in politics, where whether they're premiers and prime ministers or whether they're various ministerial positions, they shovel enormous amounts of money into the private sector. Money comes from taxpayers, grants go out, or exemptions go out of these various, regulatory approvals will go out. And then somehow, it's just pure coincidence, I'm sure, there is a job on the board of those very same companies just waiting for them when they retire from politics. It's a wonderful coincidence, don't you think?
It's just another example of the Western Australian oligarchy working remarkably well for, as you said, the rich and famous. Meanwhile, he's left behind a state with homelessness crisis, domestic violence crisis, cost of living crisis. I mean, if I was him, I'd be maybe taking a job at charity or a not-for-profit, but someone's got to earn a crust somehow, I suppose.
Try flipping burgers for a while. At least that way you might be making something useful with your life. Look, Clive Palmer's not everyone's cup of tea, but I think he's got a really good point here. The UAP have released a press release here questioning when did Mark McGowan start working for BHP? Because, of course, Clive Palmer is currently in lawsuits against the West Australian government over the fact that he was knocked back for approvals for various mines that would have been competing with BHP's interests. Do you think Clive has a point here? Is this a valid question?
It is a very valid question, and I would like to know exactly at what point did Mr. McGowan decide he was too tired to lead the Western Australian people that he professed to care about for so many years, only to run off into the sunset with his mates in the mining sector, just not the ones that challenged him over his hard border policy.
Yes, it's certainly, the Animal Farm quote, all the animals were equal, but some were more equal than others. It certainly, it has the appearance, I can't say with certainty what was going on inside Mark McGowan's mind, nor the people that recruited him to BHP or anywhere else, but it has the appearance of jobs for the boys, a bit of a quid pro quo, perhaps in return for favours done whilst he was in power. I'm not saying that definitely happened, but it certainly, I will say that it definitely has that appearance. And I think that appearance in and of itself is a huge problem. And this is something that's happening Australia-wide, not just in West Australia, and something that needs to be addressed. Well, Kate Fantinel, please keep an eye on poor old Mark for me. Make sure that his recovery continues. I lose sleep worrying about him at night. And we look forward to having you back on the Aussie Wire very soon.
Thank you. Do the right thing, as Premier McGowan said.
Well, the voice may be behind us, and in some quarters it's all over bar the shouting or the weeping, depending on which side you were on. But there are some really important lessons that we need to learn, both out of how the referendum was held and how those arguments were made, but also how we, the people, and even the media responded, and the sorts of messaging that we were giving to people, and the sorts of echo chambers that can form, often unintentionally. Rebekah Barnett, a regular here and a favourite, I've got to say, a fan favourite here on the Aussie Wire, joins us once again. You've penned an excellent blog post to do with just this question of whether or not this referendum is actually quite a historic moment in what it represents in terms of that messaging side of things. Talk us through that.
Yeah, so the question is, was the voice Australia's Brexit? And I wasn't the only person to ask that. I've seen that headline floating around online. I think that, there's a few similarities, like this proposal gets put forward and the political class thinks it's probably a fairly sure bet, and to their great surprise, they discover it was a very unsure bet. And the broad majority votes it down, and then they get called racist, and it becomes quite a fractious event for the country. And so I think we've just been through that. There's a guy called Taranto, I think it was James Taranto, who had an explanation for all of this. So it's called the Taranto Principle. A few people online have written about it. He's a bit of a cult figure. He used to have a blog called Best of the Web Today, and then he moved over to the Wall Street Journal. He continued that kind of blog for a while for the Wall Street Journal, and then now he's an editorial editor, I believe. But his hypothesis was, and this was actually well before Brexit that he was talking like this, was that over time, and this is his theory, not mine, that a fawning left-wing media essentially creates an echo chamber around the left-wing political class and convinces them that their ideas are more popular than they are, and that the Overton window has moved further left than it has. And that works for a period of time. All is well, they're getting elected in, no major problems, but at some point it just accumulates, it goes too far, and it completely backfires at the polls. And I think we saw that in Brexit. I think we saw it in the 2016 US election when Hillary Clinton lost, to the great surprise of the political elites and the elite media, but not really surprising to, again, that broad kind of working class base that voted in Donald Trump. And I think we've seen the same thing again with the referendum.
Well, you raised a couple of really interesting points. My wife and I were actually in the US shortly before that 2016 election, and we discovered something really, really quite interesting that's not troubled me, it's influenced my thinking ever since. We would travel around as tourists, very obviously Australian, very obviously tourists, and we would eat in restaurants or travel around and do different things. And you talk to people, and of course Americans love Australians. They hear the accent, oh, where are you from? And you have great conversations. We very quickly began to notice this really funny trend. We had lots of people who would voluntarily tell us that they were voting for Hillary Clinton. Now, we weren't talking about politics. It hadn't come up. Right, we've asked for directions, for crying out loud, something like that. And somehow they'll weave into the conversation the fact that they're voting for Hillary Clinton. But no one was telling us they were voting for Donald Trump. And so what we did was we started to ask people who didn't volunteer that information. It'd be someone serving the table at the restaurant or what have you, and they hadn't volunteered the information. Overwhelmingly, well, what would happen was quite funny, is we would say, so we're from Australia, we'd play stupid, we're from Australia, we've got no idea what's going on, there's this election coming up, what are you thinking? And almost invariably, they would do a quick head check, right? And they would lower their voice.
Idea.
They would lower their voice, and they'd say, well, actually, I'm thinking I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. It was amazing how, and the percentage of those people that didn't already tell us that they were voting for Hillary Clinton, they were 90% voting for Donald Trump. There was this really interesting disconnect where if you were just listening and you weren't asking and engaging with these people, you'd think everyone was voting for Hillary Clinton. But of course, the other side was just not in your face telling you. And I feel like that's the Taranto principle at that sort of common man level.
Yeah, I would agree. And then there's, add on to that, the fact that, at this stage, and I'm sure it swings back and forth, right, left. So presumably this principle would apply in the inverse, but at the moment, it would be true to say in Australian media, I think that it coalesces around left kind of biases.
Sure.
And that goes to the ABC and most of our major media outlets. Obviously, Murdoch media is one that provides a counter view, but I don't think that Murdoch media is as religiously right-wing as its critics say it is. I personally was monitoring the Voice coverage and I found it to offer actually a split of ideas, even just Chris Kenny versus Peter Credlin. But not just that, like across the board, they tend to be more orientated on clicks than particularly ideologies, certainly on this issue. Anyway, so more left media reinforcing the idea in the politician's mind that when someone does express dissent, that they're a minority voice and they don't matter anyway. And I think we saw that when Marcia Langton said that the arguments of no voters were based on racism and stupidity. And, that kind of messaging is not likely to get undecided or soft no voters on side. And that's exactly who they needed to convince. So one would think that an objective media would say, well, she did say that and, that was unfortunate, but oh, well, let's just get to the issues. But what happened was the media said, oh, that's not what she said. Actually, she really meant more like this. And that other time that she said they're all spewing racism, that's not what she meant either. And anyway, you are racist. Australians are racist. And they just reinforced the really bad messaging. And I mean bad in terms of like if you want to win.
Yeah.
And we saw that over and over again. The Ray Martin thing, he said, if you're a dinosaur or I probably can't say it on your show, but he used quite, bad language to describe people who, he said, if you don't, Google and then you vote no. And the Prime Minister said, oh, that's very powerful speech. Yeah. So it is, they're constantly reinforcing each other, how right they are, but to the detriment at the polls because nobody, the silent majority is, as you say, just thinks they're all idiots, just rolls their eyes and thinks, whatever, I'm still voting what I'm voting.
Well, this referendum has served one very useful purpose, and that is that it has drawn in very stark terms this difference between the wealthy, usually university educated, and they would see that as a very, very good thing. I personally don't. I have a different view on universities, but that's beside the point. University educated, high income, inner city dwellers. That's the demographic. Those are the people that overwhelmingly supported the yes vote. There is data to suggest that in extremely remote Indigenous communities, there was strong support for the yes vote as well. I think there are some arguments to be made around that, but nevertheless, the data is what it is. And then we have the rest of Australia. And you don't have to go very far out of that real inner city enclave to suddenly find that the polls have reversed and now the no vote is winning by a considerable margin. Canberra being the only state or territory that actually voted in favour, I think this is telling us something.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think it's telling us?
Look, in a way, you've given me language for this Taranto principle. I mean, we refer to it as being out of touch. Oh, the politicians are out of touch. We call it the Canberra bubble. I use that phrase all the time. And it does help to explain. I mean, you were talking about Marcia Langdon and so forth. And I've heard people refer to that as the deplorables moment, of course, referring to Hillary Clinton. I think even you, as we were talking before the show, Hillary Clinton referring to everyone that was opposed to her as these deplorables. And they wore that as a badge of honour and said yes, because there was such a clear divide between them and the elitism of Hillary Clinton.
Well, at the time, I went back and I had a look at some of the media coverage at that time, and I kid you not, there were pundits media pundits actually saying, yes, but Trump voters are racist bigots.
Yeah.
Like what happened.
Yeah.
And so I fully agree with you on the out of touch thing. What I found, I'm lucky because I am university educated and I have a lot of, let's say, laptop class friends, but we have a family business, which is entirely blue collar workers. And so I feel quite lucky. I've got a foot in both worlds. And, I noticed that the let's say political activist academic class were very good at articulating what they think, not so great at asking people why they think what they think. There seems to be the inbuilt assumption, I already know why you think what you think. It's because of misinformation. It's because you're a bigot. It's because you just don't have the information that I have. There's this kind of elitist assumption that, and I'm not saying this is true of all yes voters at all. I'm saying in some pockets of, the, let's say, academic and political and activist class, there does seem to be the inherent assumption that they have exclusive access to the truth with a capital T. And if you don't agree with them, it's because you just don't have the right information and they just need to give it to you, and then you'll agree with them. There's no concept. I saw in the wrap up to on the referendum night, a woman wrote a journalist wrote in The Guardian that this referendum was an empathy test and we failed the empathy test. Like as though there could be no other, like that's the explanation, like changing the constitution is an empathy test. It was just such a bizarre thing to read. And I know from talking to the blue collar workers in my network that they most certainly did not think it was an empathy test. But as you say, completely out of touch.
And we see the Magda Zhuvanskis of this world tweeting after the result was known, saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I feel so sad for all my Indigenous friends. To all those Indigenous people out there, just know that there are millions of Australians who love you and care about you." Of course, the inbuilt implication in that statement is none of the no voters love you or care about you. Just know that despite the result, there are people that can tolerate you. Okay,
not to. And that a swathe of Indigenous voters voted against The Voice. But it's absurd. And I would just say on the election night, on the referendum night, after the result was in, both Anthony Albanese and Jacinta Price, so the leaders for the Yes and the No campaign, they both said in their speeches something to the effect that, look, all Australians want what's best for Indigenous people. They just have different ideas about how to achieve that. And I thought, my goodness, if you just led with that throughout the referendum, this would have been a completely different experience that we'd had. But they didn't. They ran the Yes campaign predominantly ran with, if you don't agree with our version of what will work, you're a racist bigot and you have no empathy and you don't love Indigenous people and you're selfish, etc., etc. It was a very guilt-driven campaign. probably not intentionally, but that's what came out. And that doesn't, I'm not saying that the No campaign was blameless either, but what I'm saying is that guilt-driven messaging didn't work. I was glad to hear both of the leaders say that they think that most Australians want what's best, but it was a little bit late, I think.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, we've got some coverage coming up in the next couple of weeks after the ARC conference, when the team comes back from that, which, by the way, Rebekah, for those of you that don't know, Rebekah Barnett is joining the Aussie Wire and our ARC team in London in a couple of weeks' time. When we get back from that, I'm actually going to be sitting down with Warren Mundine and doing an in-depth interview with him to talk about some of the reforms that would actually make a very real difference on the ground. He's not denying that there are issues. Absolutely, there are issues that need to be fixed. He was one of those people saying this isn't the right solution. And so now I think it's incumbent on all of us, especially people like myself who supported the no vote, to now start exploring and saying, okay, so what are the things that we could come together around that might really start to make a difference for those people? Well, Rebekah Barnett, it is always a pleasure. Thank you once again for coming on the Aussie Wire, for bringing us this story, and we'll chat again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching the Aussie Wire. We release new episodes of the news at Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m, except for the next 2 weeks. We will have a new episode on Thursday, but then the news is taking a 2-week break to make room for our extended coverage of the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship launch. Make sure you don't miss a thing by joining our email list at theaussiewire.com. And bonus, that will also put you in the running for $300 worth of Aussie Wire merch. Plus, follow all our socials via @theaussiewire. And finally, if you're not an insider, please consider joining. Insiders are our financial supporters who make it possible for us to do what we do, and to do crazy things like sending a team of 4 journalists to London to cover the launch of the ARC. Our insiders get their own special giveaways that aren't open to the public, plus exclusive content and our insiders community. The link is in the description. I'm Topher Field, and this is the Aussie Wire.